Good to be with you, my friends. I'll share the screen and we'll jump right into the next two chapters of Genesis today. I'm getting ambitious again. We'll see if that happens. So, last time we talked about Jacob and coming back. He wrestled with God, got a new name. Then Israel, as he's now called, met his brother Esau, expecting the worst, quite frankly. And instead, he found reconciliation in life. So today we got one of the darker stories in the Old Testament, or really in any part. So this is the story of Dinah, Leah's daughter, right? So 34, chapter 34 is 100% her story, just about. Now Dinah, Leah's daughter, whom she had borne to Yaakov, went out to see the women of the land, and Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her. He took her and lay with her, forcing her. But his emotions clung to Dinah, and Yaakov's daughter, he loved the girl. He spoke to the heart of the girl. So Shechem said to Hamor his father, saying, "Take me this girl as a wife." Now Yaakov had heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter, but since his sons were with his livestock in the fields, Yaakov kept silent until they came home. Hamor, Shechem's father, went out to Yaakov to speak with him, but Yaakov's sons came back from the fields when they heard, and the men were pained, and they were exceedingly upset. For he had done a disgrace in Israel by lying with Yaakov's daughter. Such a thing is not to be done. Hamor spoke with them, saying, "My son Shechem, his emotions are so attached to your daughter. So pray give her to him as a wife, and make marriage alliances with us. Give us your daughters, and our daughters take for yourselves, and settle among us. The land shall be before you. Settle down, travel about it, obtain holdings in it." And Shechem said to her father and to her brothers, "May I only find favor in your eyes. However much you say to me, I will give in payment. To whatever extreme you multiply the bride price and the marriage gift, I will give however much you say to me. Only give me the girl as a wife." All right. Wow. So this is a confusing text on a couple of different levels. So we'll start with the easy and go to the harder ones. The first, easiest, Shechem is both the son of Hamor and the name of the town at the end of the last chapter that Israel Jacob bought to settle, right? He'd come back from being with Laban. In the first place they settle is Shechem, is the city of Shechem, and they buy land there and decide to settle in that area. He and his sons and all of his crop, all of his animals and everyone in between, right? So that's the easiest one, but it is a little confusing because you have Shechem the man and then Shechem the town. And then for that matter, Israel is obviously the person, but suddenly in verse 7, it's the land of promise, right? Such a thing is not done in Israel or in that land, right? And you go, wait, which is it? And so lots of things get confused. As a result, there are more than a few people that think that this might be a text that has been adapted. And what I mean by that is that perhaps it's more about the land of Israel and the city of Shechem and their interrelationship as peoples than necessarily a specific story about Dinah and a man named Shechem. But while that might be that's some source criticism, right? Some idea of maybe how it got written. What we have does not really record that. Instead, you have a very specific story about a very specific person and time. Even if the origins were different, we got a different tale. And that is, of course, the rape of Dinah. Now, verse 1 says that Shechem forced her to have relations, but then later it's listed as a defilement. And then you have his response as well, right? That pretty much says he loves her and he wants to be with her and wants to marry her. And you're sort of like, well, was it rape or was this a premarital relationship of some sort that they weren't supposed to have, but they did? Some scholars wonder if this perhaps was then at the end a more consensual, but it's hard to say, right? The way it's recorded, it's absolutely a rape, and then they just changed the name from rape to defilement, which is not unrelated, but it's hard to say. The story is told, if the scholars are right that this is a little bit more consensual, then it's much more about intermarriage and why that's bad than it is necessarily about abuse. But it's unclear, right? what is clear is while Shechem perhaps thought of it more in terms of dating or maybe a consensual act on some level, it is clear that Jacob and his sons believed it to be more on the rape side of things. And so if it is a rape, it's really weird for him to say, I want to marry her, right? It's if we are going to take what they seem to approach it as, which is this is a rape, it's really weird to go like, well, I liked her, so I'm gonna go ahead and marry her. It's like, what on earth is up with the Hivites, right? That this is an okay approach to getting married. Um, if that's how we were to take it on a purely polemic conversation from Israel's point of view, then these are pretty nasty people all the way around, right? But uh, it also could just be Shechem who had some level of premarital sex with her, and the family didn't like it, but he's trying to make it right. And there is a little bit of ambiguity in there, so it's not 1,000% clear. And the ambiguity continues in the text. But as the terms changed from rape to defilement, or from defilement versus guilt, Brueggemann has a quote that I thought was rather classically both understatement and a classic way that a scholar will try to name something, which is, this articulation is not the disciplined, detached reflection of professionals on the problem of uncleanliness, which is a really complex way of saying, people's emotions are a little bit higher in this situation. It's the understatement of the year, as we'll certainly we see in the next. But, and again, this is where it certainly from Hamor and Shechem's side, I'm sure they see this much more as a dating situation, because it's like, oh, well, we can connect and go deeper, which is really weird if it's a rape. But maybe, I don't know. It's so hard to know these things, right? These are levels and levels of strangeness in the story. They clearly miss. What we can say is they clearly miss that they have created deep offense. Even if they say, we'll pay up to 10 times what you ask as a penalty for what I've done, which is sort of an idea that there is guilt, but it's perhaps not a deep understanding of that guilt. It's just sort of how do we pay them off? Ooh. And we'll see the sons are having none of it. Her brothers are having none of it. But what do we think about this opening sequence? It's a tough story on lots of levels. All right, we'll keep going because it's
Well,
not.
I mean, I think a kind of a feminist take on this would say that this is problematic, sort of for the honor of the Israel and his family, with sort of less concern about the welfare of Dinah,
Yeah.
and also societally, Dinah has become sort of damaged goods, and yet we may see more focus on sort of the honor of the family than what's really the best thing for Dinah.
Well, yeah, we can certainly say from a feminist perspective, and even or a 21st century perspective, either way, even though this all happened to her, literally no one ever asks her what she thinks or wants or needs, right? I mean, at the very least, it's sort of like, wait, maybe talk to the woman involved. That weird. It's a weird sequence, right? There's no investigation of what really happened or where she really feels or wants. It's all about the guys and their honor versus, or their even understanding of their sister's honor than it is about her.
Isn't that because it's highly likely these stories were written by men?
Well, yes,
Okay.
yes, that's certainly part of it. Yes. And I mean, it's also I think it's fair to say that this is a very tribal story in a lot of ways, right? I mean, that you're one of many, many tribes in the region and in the area. And so it's our tribe versus their tribe. And so there is a question there of that sort of that we don't really understand fully today about honor and respect between the groups and how that does or doesn't work. Um, Take it a little bit out of the personal, but it's hard to when it is a personal event like this. All right, well, we'll keep going and see the brothers' response. Now, Yaakov's sons answered Shechem and Hamor his father with deceit, speaking thus because he had defiled Dinah their sister. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing. Give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that would be a reproach for us. Only on this condition will we comply with you, if you become like us by having every male among you circumcised. Then we will give you our daughters, and your daughters will take ours, and your daughters we will take for ourselves, and we will settle among you so that we become a single people. But if you do not hearken to us to be circumcised, we will take our daughter and go." Their words seemed good in the eyes of Hamor and in the eyes of Shechem, son of Hamor, and the young man did not hesitate to do the thing, for he desired Yaakov's daughter. Now he carried more weight than anyone in his father's house. When Hamor and Shechem, his son, came back to the gate of their city, they spoke to the men of their city, saying, "These men are peaceably disposed towards us. Let them settle in the land and travel about in it, for the land is certainly wide-reaching enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives for ourselves, and let us give them our daughters." But only on this condition will the men comply with us to settle among us to become a single people, that every male among us be circumcised, as they are circumcised. Their acquired livestock, their acquired property, and all their beasts, will they not then become ours? Let us only comply with them, that they may settle among us. So they hearkened to Hamor and to Shechem his son, and all who go out to war from the gate of his city. All the males were circumcised, all who go out to war from the gate of his city. But on the third day it was, when they were still herding, that two of Yaakov's sons, Shimeon or Simon and Levi, Dinah's full brothers, took each man his sword. They came upon the city, feeling secure, and killed all the males. And Hamor and Shechem his son they killed by the sword. And they took Dinah from Shechem's house and went off. Yaakov's other sons came up upon the corpses and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. Their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, whatever was inside the city and out in the field, they took. All their riches, all their little ones and their wives, they captured and plundered, as well as all that was in the houses. But Yaakov said to Shimon and to Levi, "You have stirred up trouble for me, making me reek among the settled folk of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. For I have menfolk few in number. They will band together against me and strike me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household." But they said, "Should our sister then be treated like a whore?" Okay, so we'll look first at Hamor's choices here. We got a lot, right? He and his son agreed to be circumcised. And at first, he claims he wants to live peaceably. They want to be one people. They're happy to work together. There's plenty of room, all the right answers until finally the real reason at the end. Oh, and if we get married to them, we'll take all their stuff. All those flocks and goats and sheep and camels will all be ours if we intermarry, and we'll all be richer for working together, which seems to be his much bigger reason. Like, sure, we'll get circumcised if we get all your stuff, or at least get to share your stuff. So not for the purest of causes, right? And Brueggemann sums it up nicely. Accommodation seems obviously the most profitable and secure recourse to the people of Shechem, right? We'll accommodate you because that's the best way for us all to get along and move on, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It may not be for the right reason, but it's still, people have made agreements for far worse reasons, quite frankly, than saying if we get together, we'll have better trade, better prospects. But then we learn that the sons of Israel rage over the defilement. Again, back to that term that gets used over and over again, the defilement of Dinah. And Brueggemann asks, or notes really, insistence upon circumcision was posed not for purposes of faithfulness, but for purposes of social control and exploitation. This most previous symbol of faith has now become a tool of inhumanity. In other words, Brueggemann's pretty clear that this is absolute corruption of what God had intended circumcision to be, which is to be a marker of the covenant with God. Now it's just exploited to control and to, well, injure, wound, and kill, right? Even more, Brueggemann does make a very clear claim that it's completely disproportionate to the crime. If it is a rape, even it seems wildly out of response to kill all of the men, take their wives and their children and all their animals and belongings, right? That's pretty big response for something that it does matter, but that's a very large response. But then he makes it more even clear about what he believes, which is the passionate vengeance is transparently self-serving. What they seized, they did not destroy. They kept it for themselves so that their taking was not righteous indignation, but an act of confiscation for self-gain. In other words, Brueggemann says, well, they might have started off angry, but at the end of the day, they did it all to get rich themselves. So you can point to Shechem as being a little craven with his idea that all of their belongings would become his, but at the end, the sons of Israel are more than happy to just steal all the stuff for themselves and have almost the same. Maybe they started with anger and vengeance, but by the end, they're in the same boat taking stuff too, which I think is an accurate one. And I agree with Brueggemann completely. But I'm just not sure the text, not test. The text doesn't condemn them in quite the same way that Brueggemann does. I want to condemn them like Brueggemann does, but the text just sort of says, well, this is the issue. And you have a sort of back and forth with Jacob, but at the end they're like, what? You want to we're not going to treat our daughter as a whore, but our sister as a whore, but it's a weird, it's not a easy or clear story. So thoughts on that side of the text. This, like I said, this is one of the knottier questions we have in all of Genesis, quite frankly, because this is one of those you're like, are we supposed to agree with the sons of Israel? Are we supposed to agree with Israel, who sort of goes, y'all have done a bad thing and disgraced me? Or is it, do we do a feminist reading, sort of like Lynn was saying, and talk about how she is completely disregarded and treated horribly as well in this? I mean, there's so many ways we can look at this and none of them with really a lesson that you go, I feel good about it, or at least not for me.
Bill, where is God in this story?
Oh.
I think he's taking a nap.
I think so. I think so, Lynn. Yep.
This was hard. I mean, that
fine.
was a huge thing that they all agreed to be circumcised and to do all this and then to turn around and yeah, you think, okay, how much was actually for their sister's honor and how much was just for what they were going to gain? Greed, yeah.
Pure unadulterated, yeah.
I mean, it seemed like they, oh my goodness. I don't know.
It's
Yeah,
interesting.
it seems like your basic tribal warfare.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
it was interesting to me last week. Y'all were talking about, we couldn't really respond as we were riding in the car, but y'all were talking about getting angry with God and wrestling with him and all of this type stuff. Some of that I can understand, but this is unacceptable as far as God is concerned. And yet I don't, is Lynn, as you said, he's in there taking a nap. He must have.
no, I think Greg or somebody
Was it
said
Greg?
that.
Whoever
Somebody
said
had said that
He was
taking.
taking a nap. I guess he fell asleep with the popcorn in his lap.
I don't know. I mean, it's like, wow, that was awful. And to take their wives and children and
Yeah, it's pretty ugly.
The behavior on all levels leaves a lot to be desired.
Yes.
That's an understatement.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
oh, terrible.
All right, so I'm going to take it in a little bit different direction. So Jacob does condemn them for it. I mean, let's be clear, but he actually doesn't necessarily condemn them. I mean, if I had been their dad, I'd been like, what are you doing? This is not who we are. We're wrong. I mean, you're wrong for doing it, all these terrible things. But he just sort of goes, it's going to be bad for business and trade, and we're going to get threatened by other people. It's not necessarily the actions themselves. It's like, you just created a problem for me. It's more of his complaint than necessarily a full condemnation. But Brueggemann notes the actions of his son have made him abhorrent to this context. It's a painful blow to this one who has been a homeless refugee all his life. Now he has come into the land, the promised land, right? And has become a rejected presence as a result of this foolish action. Okay, fair enough, but it's not it's still not a full-throated condemnation that you would expect from someone. And again, you sort of have this weird in-between response that Jacob gives. And Brueggemann, really, I think the more important thing, he says, sadly, at the end of the narrative, Jacob's sons have learned nothing and concede nothing, right? I mean, Jacob does not, or Israel does not upbraid them. He doesn't tell them they're terrible, and they learn nothing by like the whole situation. They got a bunch of stuff. They're pretty happy. They feel like they're justified. That's the end of the story. And you go, not a great sequence. And you can look at it as a one-off story, or personally, I think this is setting the stage to a certain degree. This is foreshadowing of how those sons of Jacob are going to act when they get angry at anybody, or perhaps Joseph, as we know how the story goes, right? That they seem to be folks who get really angry and respond pretty irrationally to a whole variety of issues. And so on one level, you're sort of, I think this is almost the character study of the sons of Jacob and how they're going to handle stuff, which is pretty fiercely and pretty reactive, right?
Well, that upbringing there in Laban's household must have been pretty dysfunctional.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely have the portrait of a fractured family, if nothing else.
You know, it's interesting. I went to a college where I had to take Old Testament. It was a Methodist school. And these stories right here were totally omitted from the Old Testament study. I think that was interesting.
They just didn't want to get into
No,
it. They didn't want to discuss it.
No, we moved on to the next exciting thing in the Bible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is one that this does not come up in the church's lectionary either, I might add. We don't have a Sunday morning reading of the rape of Dinah.
Thanks be to God.
Yeah. Amen.
I was
Amen.
just going to ask how much airtime this one gets on Sunday mornings.
Precious little.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a story. It's a story. Well, we'll continue.
I was just going to say, this is just not an educational comment at all, but do y'all remember the Little Golden Books series of children's books? Like, I grew up with them as a child. I'd love to see the Little Golden Book version of this stuff.
I don't think it would make it into the
I don't think it would make it
Little
into
Golden Books.
Uh-uh.
We still have a shelf of those upstairs that belong to our children.
I will say, when I was doing youth ministry a million years ago, a group of kids, as we were studying the Bible, a group of guys who had their tongue planted firmly in cheek, but decided to start keeping a list of the most ignoble deaths in Scripture, and this was certainly one in the list for Shechem and his dad Hamor and the whole situation, right? Of like, just what on earth? How people who die or get killed in weird ways at different points, they're like, oh yeah, this is going in the list. It's like, yeah, this is going in the list of bad endings all around. All right, so we'll keep going and see what happens next, which is now going into chapter 35. Now, God said to Yaakov, arise, go up to Bethel, and stay there. Construct a slaughter site there, or an altar, to God, El, who was seen by you when you fled from Esau, your brother. And Yaakov said to his household and to all who are with him, put away the foreign gods that are in your midst. Purify yourselves, change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel. There I will construct a slaughter site to the God who answered me on the day of my distress. He was with me on the way that I went. So they gave Yaakov all the foreign gods that were in their hand, along with the sacred rings that were in their ears, and Yaakov concealed them under the oak Elah that is near Shechem. Then they moved on. Now a dread from God lay upon the towns that were around them, so they did not pursue Yaakov's sons. So Yaakov came back to Luz, which is the land of Canaan, that is now Beth-el-Hay, and all the people that were with him. There he built a slaughter site and called the place Godhead El of Bethel, for there had been the power of God had been revealed to him when he fled from his brother. Now Deborah, Rivkah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel, beneath the oak, and they called its name Alon Bakut, Oak of Weeping. God was seen by Yaakov again when he came back from the country of Aram, and he gave him his blessing. And God said to him, Yaakov, is your name Yaakov, shall your name be called no more, for your name shall be Israel. And he called his name Israel. God said further to him, I am Shaddai. Bear fruit and be many. Nation, yes, a host of nations shall come from you. Kings shall go out from your loins. The land that I gave to Abraham and to Yitzhak, I give to you, I give it, and to your seed after you, I give the land. And God went up from beside him at the place where he had spoken with him. And Yaakov set up a standing pillar at the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a poured offering on it and cast oil upon it. And Yaakov called the name of the place where God had spoken with him, Bet-El, house of God. All right, so Brueggemann believes this chapter is the perfect antidote to the previous one, while 34 has about 5 or 6 different comments about defilement. Chapter 35 is about purify and purification and rededicating yourself to God. So while there isn't an explicit condemnation in 34 of what the sons do, Jacob, to a certain degree, is showing repentance by saying, change your clothes. We've got to purify ourselves. We've got to rededicate ourselves to God, get rid of the idols. It's definitely a moment of cleansing on some level, right? He also notes that Israel must make a decision. That is not just the person, but as a community. You cannot kill all the Canaanites, and you cannot leave the land. So what do you do? Right? That's the theoretical question, or the rhetorical question Brueggemann poses. And his response is, the way chosen to do this without either destructiveness or accommodation is by the way of radical symbolization. Israel engages in dramatic ritual activity as a mode of faithfulness. So the idea, again, is that Israel is going to stay in the land, and they're not going to be accommodating too much to the people around them, but instead they're going to take on symbols and approaches and practices that set them apart as different and dedicated to God, right? Now, this current in Israel's history has massive repercussions in Jewish and Christian approaches to faith. That is, there's a tradition through both of our histories which focuses on being different, right? It reinforces a faithfulness that says, I've been called by God to be something different. After all, the church, ecclesia, means in Greek, those called out of other people. For Jews, it is to be the promised people of God. And then you've got to live your life differently than all the people around you, right? That's the explicit instruction for Christians and Jews alike, that God is asking us to be better or to do more or to be different. Everyone else in society, though, what happens is a lot of times there's a shadow, and it's basically, you'll hear people preach it, right? Everyone else in society is sick and depraved and problematic. We inside the church, we inside the synagogue have different values. We are different. We are chosen to be God's new action in the world, right? This can, though, as you can imagine, this leads to a lot of problems. You end up antagonizing others and making the faithful an easy target. If you basically go, we're better than everybody else, and you can tell we're better because we do this, well, then it's really easy to point and say, hey, there's the people who think we're better than everyone else. They've got phylacteries. They take Sundays off. They take Fridays and Saturdays off. I mean, like, there's lots of ways that you can very easily begin to notice them because you have now set yourself apart. Worse, it creates what I call a toxic reinforcement loop, which is what I think happens in a lot of things that happen in our society right now. That is, we are different, we are better is how it starts, right? Which is not necessarily bad into itself, but God's calling us to do more. But then it's this weird thing like, oh, well, if people persecute us, that proves that they're bad and we're better. It proves we're different and they're wrong. right? So if you get a negative reinforcement, it's almost proof that you are doing the right thing, which then encourages even more devout choices that continue to make the community different. This is how people get caught up in cults. It's how people get caught up. Certainly, I would say a lot of the stuff that happens right now with all of the different subgroups in our society that happen, basically the mainstream media is telling you you're wrong, and then everybody starts yelling at you. That's proof that you're standing against the mainstream media, right? It's a weird, there's no way to break that loop to a certain degree and go, but it's a lie, or what you're saying isn't true, or you just get caught in this situation where there's no real clear way out because of the way it's defined. Or said a little differently, why did I bring that up? Because some of these ideas of purity that sets us apart model is what fueled the anger over the homosexuality debates. It's what fuels the QAnon debates. All these ideas that, oh, well, we're a group that's more pure and set apart and right. Okay. And that purity then sets us right. So what has happened is, to be clear, no book in the Bible links any sexuality to salvation. It doesn't. There, you can't find it. It might be unclean. It might be an abomination to have sex before marriage, or to lie as a man with another man, right? All these kinds of things that they talk about, but there's nothing that says you're going to go to hell for it or you lose everything for it. But what is linked very clearly is, like in this case, sexual purity is a marker of the community, right? That don't end up like Dina, who either got raped or who had sex before marriage. You got to be clean and pure instead, right? And so that's the whole kind of thing. And I don't have an answer to any of this, but I think it's worth noting that there's a deep current in our tradition and in the Christian tradition, that is the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, that says, oh, well, God is setting us apart to do something special, and therefore we have to be attendant to our differences, and that's what makes us who we are, right? It's not purely Levitical code. There's a deeper definition here of that sort of faithful remnant people will talk about. I wanted to bring it up because it's out there and people sort of act like it's not, but this is a pretty deep line throughout Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament alike, that we don't name, but we need to name, at least in part, to say, well, it's there. What do we do with it? Anybody have thoughts or comments on that? I mean, like I said, I don't have an answer for it. I just know that it's out there and we need to name it.
Yeah, people sure try to infer that Leviticus, and I think maybe something in Deuteronomy and certainly something in Romans say all of these things that they don't really say. But
Yeah.
People print out those verses and shake them in the faces of other people, thinking that they've got all the answers.
Yeah, there's been a couple books. I think it's called The 7 Verses Against Homosexuality, but that's it, like on the totality of Scripture that and even some of those are not altogether clearly anti-gay, or against homosexuality. They're just in broad reference to sexual purity and that kind of process, which a lot of times those arguments then, as we know, become cyclical, where it's like, well, you can't have sex outside of marriage. You're like, well, then marry him. Well, then, but no, we can't marry him. You're like, well, then you can't tell someone they can't do something when you don't give them the path for another way of doing it either. Like we'll lock them out of the house and then claim that they can't be here because they're locked. They're not in the house. Okay.
Bill, how does love your neighbor as yourself fit into all of this?
I think that's the real challenge, right? I mean, I think that's the real challenge to all of us, where we are called, on one hand, to a higher ideal. We're called to dedicate ourselves to loving God and our neighbor in a very clear way. And that is different than the average Joe in the streets, let's say. But I would go back to the song, right? They'll know we are Christians by our love. They should know us because we're a loving community who wants others to be part of the community, not because we are an elite cable of superhumans, right? Because we're not. We tend to just be people doing the best we can in a complex situation who believes that love is a better way. That'd be my answer to it, but it's certainly there would be some of our sisters and brothers in other denominations or in other parts of Christian faith who would say, no, God loves them, but they've got to make their life better and fix the things they're doing wrong. And we've got to help them get to that place, right? I mean, that's how others would do it. That's not how I understand my work in ministry, but that's how others would name it, right? To keep in that sort of what marks us is a certain way of doing things that is different from the rest of the world. And to be as fair as possible to those folks, be they Baptist or evangelical, it is often done out of love. I would argue a little misguided love, but it is out of love. It's not like most of the folks I know at evangelical or Baptist churches are terrible, evil, horrible people. Not at all. But they just will say, God's calling us to live a very specific way, and I think you got to live this way to be in it, which again goes back to that idea of purity codes and ideals.
But isn't it an issue of my trying to tell you how your life should be rather than trying to pay attention to my own failings?
Yes.
I mean, I got enough sins of my own on my own plate. And y'all just have to deal with yours.
Yeah.
Well
Amen.
said, Betty.
Yep, I think that's exactly. I mean, I agree because that's, I think, who we are at our best. But there is just that long tradition of, I mean, Episcopalians even 50 years ago, 60 years ago would have been writing this track of saying, no, you got to come and do our service on our day the way we claim to do it. I mean, we have changed as a denomination in this process as well, and our understanding of how this works. I would say for the better, because 60, 70 years ago, they would have said Black folks don't need to come into the church and women shouldn't have leadership positions and all kinds of things, right? That we would say that's not how we understand church today.
Or that slavery was right.
Yep.
But I kind of think we've gone too far the other way. I mean, now we condemn the Baptists and the evangelicals. And I don't agree with them.
Right.
But, again, I got my own judgmentalism to deal with.
Amen. I agree completely. I think we have gone too far the other way and made other groups the pariah. But anytime we're scapegoating anyone or pointing the finger at somebody else, we're in trouble.
Yep.
Well, when you point one finger at somebody, you've got three others pointing back at yourself.
Amen. Amen.
Well, I heard a wise person once say, you've got to decide, he said this for himself, I've got to decide whether I'm going to be a judger or a lover.
Yeah.
Yep. I agree with that too.
I don't know if there's a commandment that says judge one another, but
no, I haven't heard that one.
No,
Not in any of my copies.
No, I either.
Yeah.
All right, so just to finish up this section, so what comes from this whole process of changing clothes, purifying themselves, putting away the old gods, a new name that becomes official and more importantly, communal, right? Like, so yes, Jacob's name was changed when he wrestled with the man, with God at Peniel, but this time it's at Bethel, at the house of God, and the whole family is gathered and included in that renaming now, right? What was before a very personal individualistic model. Now everyone is there, everyone is changing and making a choice to live a different life on some level, dedicate themselves to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so now it's more of a communal naming, more of a communal process. But now here is a place of promise, Bethel, the house of God, right? Bethel. Both Freeman and Brueggemann make the same anachronistic connection to baptism. They'll say, look, there's a new garment, there's a new name, the renunciation of old gods and evil. It's just like our baptism. Which again, I make very clear, I think is anachronistic. It comes, 2,000-3,000 years after the story. I get the connections, but I don't know. It's there, but I feel like we took it from this, not the other way around. That we've copied the pattern of putting away the old and wearing a new garment and getting a new name. But it's not the other way around. Which for those who don't know, this is always, whenever I do baptisms, especially for children and young adults, I'll always say, once upon a time you had your Christian name, and sometimes it was different than your previous name, that you wanted to literally end your old life. And so people, especially in the early days of the Roman Empire, would change their names from, say, Julius, named in honor of Caesar. Instead, they're going to make their name Paulus in honor of Paul, right? They would take on a new name to say that they're now a different person and a new creation in Christ. No one has ever taken me up on changing their name or their child's name, but there is an ancient part of our tradition that does that. And then a final note from Freetham that I found interesting. We get the story of Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, and it comes out of nowhere. And her death, and he claims, and this is a quote from him, the author includes a note about the little people who are more important in the larger story than one typically appreciates. Because Deborah doesn't really show up anywhere else, but she's actually mentioned here. And, people say they loved her and buried her here, right? It's just an interesting kind of weird, process there. So, but here's the thing that he also notes: at the same time, we are never told of Rebecca's death and burial in the text. Rebecca has disappeared completely. But her nurse gets mentioned, which makes it even stranger that Deborah gets mentioned, but Rebecca didn't. This is the Murray edit, which is effectively what? We haven't heard or seen from Rebecca since she guided her son into stealing the blessing. Take that for what it is, but I do think there's an unstated condemnation of Rebecca in the text. That she is the one who taught her son how to steal the birthright and the blessing specifically, right? She is the one who caused some of this trouble and problems. Clearly, she stuck around and took the heat from Isaac and Esau, but she's pretty much persona non grata, quite literally. She just disappears from the text, even though being the mother of Esau and Jacob, she's just gone. Mentioning her servant and not her speaks even more. Talk about a slap in the face. Like, oh, her servant died, but whatever. Yeah, I think she has paid pretty dearly for her role. That's the Murray edit. Neither of the commentaries even mentioned that, but I'm like, wait a second. If she's never mentioned again and she dies off screen and isn't even mentioned being buried, I feel like that's maybe something that we could name, that sometimes absence is as big a statement as presence, right?
But Esau disappeared too.
Esau's disappeared, but he shows back up from time to time. Esau will show back up and hug his brother, or they bury dad later, and that kind of stuff. And then they'll list the Esau lineage, right? But Rebecca's the one that is fully cut from the text.
She's a female, Bill.
Well, that's true. She's a mom. Who cares, I guess?
Yeah, right.
Maybe that's it. All right, so the conclusion of this chapter, we'll do super fast here because we're running out of time. But they departed from Bethel, but when there was still a stretch of land to come to Ephrat, Rahel began to give birth, and she had a very hard birthing. It was when her birthing was at its hardest that the midwife said to her, "Do not be afraid, for this one too is a son for you." It was as her life was slipping away, for she was dying, that she called his name Ben-Oni, son of my woe. But his father called him Benjamin, son of the right hand. So Rahel died, and she was buried along the way to Ephrat, that is now Bethlehem. And Yaakov set a standing pillar over her burial place. That is Rahel's burial pillar of today. So the death of Rachel in childbirth, finally giving Jacob, Israel, his 12th and final son and her second son. But we also have to note it's been 20 years or so since he took Rachel in marriage and came back home, or first met Rachel and married her and had children and all the rest of it. So she is certainly, all of them are older, right? This is a late in life childbirth, to say the least, for them, which then, of course, results in Rachel's death. And then we can say that Rachel's tomb is still closely guarded in Bethlehem. Israel has literally built one of their great barrier walls around the location of Rachel's tomb in the middle of Bethlehem. It's a fascinating little nook that they have cordoned off to make sure that the Palestinians don't mess with it. Then we have Rachel's weeping, right? She weeps at her at that moment of giving birth and that moment of knowing that perhaps she's dying. And Freetham notes that Rachel's weeping lives on in Israel's memory, noted not least in the reference to Jacob's pillar, but it works powerfully in Jeremiah 31:15-17, and in reference to the slaughter of the Holy Innocents in and around Bethlehem at Jesus' birth, right? We just read it. We didn't read this passage, but we read the Jeremiah passage this past Sunday, right? Which is an interesting thing. Rachel is then used to express feminine and suffering images for God in the Old Testament, which is a sort of fascinating turn, but it clearly has it's a big moment on the life of Jacob / Israel and in the community that Rachel dies giving birth to the beloved Benjamin. And I don't know if I have more to say about it. It's just an interesting note, especially since it connects with our patron saint. I knew on one level that this was the connection, but I didn't make a connection to this particular passage, right? I tend to think of it more in terms of Jeremiah because that's who gets quoted. But it's interesting. She is weeping in this text for the birth of her son as she dies. And it's not clear if she's weeping because she's given birth or if she realizes that she won't be able to raise him and be there with him. But it's definitely a sad moment of both life and death, right? But that's very different from the loss of children that is enshrined in Jeremiah and in Matthew. But theologically, we obviously connected them. So I don't know if there's anything to discuss. I just wanted to name it. Does anybody want to add to that or reflect on that? Okay. So here's the balance of the chapter. Israel departed and spread his tent beyond Migdal Eder, herd tower. And it was when Israel was dwelling in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard. Now the sons of Yaakov were 12. And this is a bizarre story. There's one sentence about him like sleeping with his dad's concubine, and then it just sort of gets left as that. It's not mentioned again, but you get an idea again. The sons are not such great guys all the time. Now the sons of Yaakov were 12. The sons of Leah, Yaakov's firstborn, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, Issachar, and Zebulun. And the sons of Rahel, Yosef, and Benjamin. And the sons of Bilhah, Rahel's maid, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's maid, Gad and Asher. These were Yaakov's sons who were born to him in the country of Aram. And then we have to say parenthetically, well, except for Benjamin, who was born in Bethel, but yes, or in Bethlehem. And Yaakov came home to Yitzhak, his father, at Mamre in the city of Arba, that is now Hebron, where Abraham and Yitzhak had sojourned. And the days of Yitzhak were 100 years and 80 years. Then Yitzhak expired. He died and was gathered to his kinspeople, old and satisfied in days. Esau, and Yaakov, his sons, buried him. Okay. What a strange ending to Isaac's story, right? I didn't even know the dude was alive. He's not mentioned at all. It's not really. It's sort of like, well, we'll give him a nice send off. His sons are there. How lovely, but Isaac hasn't been mentioned in 8 chapters, 10 chapters. It's been a long time since Isaac has played any role in this tale. I guess the beautiful thing is that Jacob and Esau are seen together again as they bury their dad. There's reconciliation on some level after all the strife. And we should hear the echo then of Ishmael and Isaac burying Abraham. But it's still, that's about it. We don't see or hear a whole lot more. Chapter 36, the next chapter is the lineage of Esau. And so we learn what happens with him and his family and the conclusion of his story. So there's a little bit more about Esau, but he, as Stefan mentioned, he pretty much disappears from the text as well because it's all about Jacob. And even interestingly, Jacob's story is pretty much done. I mean, he's in parts of the tale from now on, but it's almost 100% the sons who take on the narrative force and drive. Like it's all about Joseph and the brothers and what's going on with that. Next week, we'll look at that story for the brothers. I didn't know if I didn't have anything more brilliant to say about that conclusion because it is a sort of quirky ending, certainly to Isaac's tale, but that finishes up Isaac. Thoughts on any of today? We've had rape, we've had all kinds of marriage and parties, and it's a day, right? When you do these 2 chapters.
His sons are bad. Oh goodness.
Yeah, you don't get an idea that they're the righteous of the land, do you?
No.
After that, I need a shower and a nap.
That's second emotion.
Oh my goodness.
I think I need a glass of wine too, Craig.
Yeah.
You get that Merlot like that lady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'll open
Take it to
a bottle of
grocery.
Merlot. Yeah.
Hey, Lynn, you started to talk, but you're muted, Lynn.
It's like they changed the family name to go into the witness protection program.
Yeah.
They would need it.
Good point.
Yeah, we're no longer the Jacobites. We're now the Israelites. Yeah. Yeah.
You got to figure too, they alienated a lot of people around them.
Really?
That's why
Yes, they did just a fine job of that.
Oh my gosh.
That's why they had to be new and improved. Change the name.
Really?
And it doesn't stop. Okay, it continues, folks.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes.
tell you what.
Perfect.
That's
Well,
all
good to be
interesting.
with you, and we'll enjoy the Joseph story. That's the balance of Genesis, right? The last from this point all the way to chapter 49 are all the Joseph stories. So we'll enjoy that next, which is a fine way to sort of push through here to the end of the text. Good to be with you, my friends. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you Sunday.
Thanks.
All
Great to
right.
see everybody, Mike.
okay, take care.
Good to see y'all.
Bye.
Bye.